Awaken your spirit chosen ones. The moment someone starts watching you closely, it's rarely because you're lost. It's because you don't fit. At some point, curiosity turns into concern, not the loud, dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, professional kind. The kind that takes notes, cross-checks behavior, and watches from a distance without blinking. That's where this story begins. Not with paranoia, not with ego, but with a private investigator doing what they're trained to do: follow patterns, document inconsistencies, and explain what doesn't make sense. Here's a fact most people don't realize. Private investigators aren't hired to chase people who are failing. They're hired when something doesn't add up, when outcomes don't match effort, when reactions don't match pressure, when a person keeps slipping through psychological boxes like a bar of soap nobody can hold on to. And according to behavioral studies, humans rely on predictability to feel safe. Remove predictability, and attention sharpens fast. That's exactly what happened here. You weren't loud. You weren't chasing influence. You weren't trying to prove anything. Yet doors opened without knocking, tensions formed without confrontation, and people around you changed course after brief interactions. To a trained eye, that's not coincidence. That's disruption. Subtle, silent, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who prefers neat explanations. Now here's the funny part. While someone was professionally tailing you, you were probably just trying to live your life, paying bills, avoiding unnecessary conversations, maybe even wondering why people suddenly started acting strange around you. Nothing humbles a serious investigation like realizing the subject isn't plotting anything. They're just minding their business and somehow causing ripples anyway. What they found wasn't scandal. It wasn't secrets. It was something far more unsettling. A person who didn't react on schedule, didn't break under pressure, and didn't move according to expectation. And when you don't move the way the world predicts, the world starts watching. Stay with me, because what the investigation uncovered says less about being followed, and everything about why. Number one, they weren't tracking your movements. They were tracking your patterns. What caught their attention wasn't where you went or who you spoke to. It was how repeatable you were in moments where most people aren't. Humans are messy. We contradict ourselves, panic under pressure, overreact when things don't go our way. You didn't. Your behavior followed a quiet internal logic, and that's the kind of thing professionals notice fast. Not because it's flashy, but because it's rare. You responded to stress without spiraling. You adjusted without announcing it. When situations shifted, you didn't cling to old decisions just to protect your pride. That alone breaks most behavioral expectations. People usually double down when they feel challenged. You recalibrated. Over time, those small choices stacked up into something visible. Not dramatic, not suspicious, just consistent in a world built on inconsistency. Patterns tell more truth than actions. Anyone can act calm once. Anyone can make a smart move by accident. But when your reactions line up again and again, when your decisions show restraint instead of impulse, that creates a profile. And your profile didn't match the usual templates. You weren't reckless, but you weren't passive. You weren't controlling, yet you weren't easily influenced. That middle ground is uncomfortable to analyze because it doesn't give easy answers. What really stood out was how little energy you wasted. No excessive explaining, no emotional oversharing, no need to perform confidence. You moved when it made sense and stayed still when it didn't. That kind of efficiency isn't taught socially. It's learned through awareness, and awareness leaves a trail. To someone trained to observe, this wasn't coincidence. It was compression. Fewer actions producing stronger outcomes. You avoided traps not by fighting them, but by not stepping into them at all. You didn't chase validation, yet people adjusted around you. That reversal matters. Influence usually flows outward through effort. Yours flowed quietly through presence and timing. So no, they weren't interested in your footsteps. They were studying your rhythm. Because when someone keeps beating the odds without looking like they're trying, the question isn't where they're going, it's how they keep arriving exactly where they need to be. Number 2, your life didn't show chaos, it showed compression. What stood out wasn't confusion or instability, it was speed. Things that normally take years were happening in a much shorter span of time, and not in a reckless way. You weren't jumping randomly from one phase to another. Each change built directly on the last, like steps taken 2 at a time instead of 1. To an outside observer, that kind of momentum doesn't look lucky. It looks intentional, even when the person living it isn't consciously trying to accelerate anything. Most lives stretch out. Lessons repeat. Mistakes linger. People stay stuck in loops because growth is usually slow and padded with comfort. Yours wasn't. Decisions carried weight immediately. Consequences arrived fast. Wins and losses both landed closer together, leaving little room for denial or delay. That's compression. It's what happens when avoidance disappears and reality responds without buffering. What made this unsettling was how little wasted motion there was. You didn't spend long arguing with circumstances. You adapted, trimmed what didn't work, and moved forward. That doesn't mean everything was easy. It means everything was processed quickly. Emotional recovery didn't drag on for years. Setbacks didn't turn into identities. You extracted the lesson and kept going, while others were still replaying the moment. To someone trained to analyze behavior, this signals internal alignment. When values, awareness, and action line up, life speeds up. Not because it's kind, but because there's no internal friction slowing it down. You weren't waiting for permission, closure, or applause. You responded in real time. That compresses timelines whether you intend it or not. This kind of life often gets misread. From the outside, it can look intense or overwhelming. But intensity isn't the same as disorder. Chaos scatters energy. Compression concentrates it. Your experience is stacked instead of spilling everywhere. Each chapter closed faster, but not sloppily. Loose ends were tied without ceremony. That's what raised eyebrows. Fast growth without collapse. Rapid change without loss of direction. When someone moves through phases at that pace and still stays grounded, it challenges the assumption that growth must be slow to be real. Compression doesn't ask for attention, but it's impossible to ignore. Because when time itself seems to bend around someone, observers stop asking what happened and start asking how. Number 3. People around you changed after contact, not before. What caught the investigator's eye wasn't you acting differently. It was how the people you interacted with began to shift immediately after being near you. Friends, colleagues, even casual acquaintances suddenly made choices that seemed unprompted, but the timing told a different story. Decisions, moods, priorities, even alliances altered subtly but noticeably after brief interactions with you. It wasn't manipulation, and it wasn't coercion. It was something far more subtle, influence that didn't announce itself. Most people leave predictable traces. They inspire through charm, pressure, or obvious persuasion. But your presence had a quieter, almost gravitational pull. Conversations ended with others reconsidering paths they hadn't questioned before. Behaviors that seemed settled suddenly adjusted. People didn't just react, they recalibrated. It was as if proximity to you forced a mental realignment. The investigator noticed these patterns repeated enough to know it wasn't coincidence. What made this deeply unsettling to observe was the invisibility of the effect. Unlike leaders who command attention, You didn't push or instruct. You weren't loud or dominant. Yet something about your timing, your energy, your awareness left gaps in others' certainty. Those gaps were filled by introspection or shifts in behavior. Colleagues might start working differently, friends might make surprising choices, and even strangers seemed to respond in ways that benefited the flow around you, not because they were told to, but because they were unconsciously influenced by your consistency. It was a quiet power, almost impossible to measure directly, yet impossible to ignore. The investigator realized that while most people can control themselves, they can't fully control how they are perceived or how their presence interacts with others' decisions. What you did wasn't dramatic, but it created ripples, subtle actions, slight shifts in expression, calm responses in tense situations. All of it combined to provoke change externally without conscious effort. And that's the moment that makes people pause. Your influence was organic, invisible, and undeniably effective. It left no evidence on paper, no bragging rights, just outcomes. People weren't just around you, they were being reshaped by you, quietly and consistently, and that is a force few recognize until it's undeniable. Number 4, you weren't searching for power. Power kept finding you. What stood out wasn't ambition, it was restraint. You weren't chasing control, status, or dominance, yet situations kept placing leverage in your hands. Opportunities arrived without you announcing readiness. Influence showed up without you asking for it. That's what made it unsettling to observe. Most people who gain power are loud about wanting it. You weren't. And yet authority kept orbiting you like it had nowhere else to land. You didn't position yourself as the center, but decisions started waiting on you anyway. People paused to hear your response. Outcomes shifted after you spoke, even briefly. Not because you demanded anything, but because your words carried weight without force. That kind of gravity doesn't come from hunger. It comes from clarity. You weren't trying to win. You were trying to understand, and understanding is far more dangerous than desire. What made this more striking was how often power found you during moments of withdrawal. When you stepped back, influence didn't disappear. It condensed. People leaned in closer, systems adjusted, responsibility followed you even when you avoided it. That reversal is rare. Most people lose relevance when they disengage. You gained it, and to someone trained to analyze behavior, that signals inner authority rather than external ambition. You also didn't hoard control. When power appeared, you didn't cling to it. You used it briefly, precisely, then let it go. That unsettles people more than domination ever could, because it shows you're not dependent on influence to feel stable. You can walk away, and anyone who can walk away from power without fear immediately becomes powerful in a different way. There was no hunger in your actions, no grasping, just alignment. You responded when necessary and stayed silent when it wasn't. That balance made people trust you without knowing why. Trust turns into leverage fast. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that reshapes outcomes behind the scenes. So no, you weren't hunting for power. That's what made it keep finding you. Because power is drawn to those who don't need it to validate themselves. And once that pattern becomes visible, observers stop asking how you gained influence and start realizing you never went looking for it at all. Number 5, your resistance to manipulation stood out more than your confidence. It wasn't that you acted boldly or tried to assert dominance. What shocked the observer was how little anyone could bend you, shape your decisions, or influence your emotions. People are usually predictable when pressure is applied. Threats, flattery, or subtle nudges can steer them off course without much effort. You didn't follow that rule. You responded on your own terms, in your own timing, and with your own reasoning. That kind of unshakable self-possession is rare, and it makes anyone studying you take notice immediately. Manipulation relies on assumptions about human weakness. The idea that someone will panic, overreact, or cling to approval. You didn't. You didn't fight back aggressively either. You simply didn't supply the openings. That's what made your presence unnerving. You weren't confrontational. You weren't distant in a way that repelled. You just existed in a way that refused to be molded. And people noticed it subconsciously. They tried subtle moves, testing boundaries, tossing in half-truths and expectations. You treated each with calm clarity, choosing whether it mattered without needing to justify yourself. That quiet discernment signals power in a way confidence alone never does. What made it extraordinary wasn't just the resistance itself, but the ripple effect it caused. Others around you started revealing more about themselves than they intended, often trying to gauge your reactions. They over-explained, misstepped, or contradicted themselves. Your stability exposed their instability. It wasn't about control, it was about presence. Simply by existing in alignment with your own judgment, you set an unspoken standard, and anyone interacting with you had to adjust or stumble. This is what the investigator noticed first. It wasn't your achievements, your charisma, or even your calm. It was your immunity to pressure that revealed the deeper truth. You couldn't be moved by ordinary expectations, and that made you unpredictable in the most powerful sense. Resistance doesn't demand recognition, but it leaves traces. And the traces you left screamed one thing clearly. You respond to the world on your terms, not anyone else's. Number 6. Conflict followed you, but escalation never stuck. Wherever you went, tension seemed to appear around you, but it never exploded the way it does for most people. Arguments, disagreements, and challenges cropped up naturally in life, yet they didn't spiral out of control when you were involved. That's what the observer noticed first. Most people either fuel conflict or crumble under it. You did neither. Instead, you navigated it in a way that kept the fire alive enough to be noticed, but never enough to consume everything in its path. It wasn't avoidance. You didn't step back in fear or silence. You didn't pretend problems didn't exist. You addressed them on your terms, calmly, deliberately, and without unnecessary drama. That combination is rare because humans are wired to react instinctively. Panic, anger, or pride usually takes over, making conflicts larger than they should be. You didn't feed that instinct. You responded rationally, measured your energy, and let others reveal themselves while you stayed grounded. That subtle skill left observers both impressed and unsettled. What made it extraordinary was the way outcomes shifted around you. People who were ready to escalate would pause or rethink their approach after interacting with you. Disagreements didn't resolve through pressure but through quiet recalibration. You didn't have to dominate the situation to change it. Simply being present, with composure intact, was enough to redirect the energy. That's not luck. That's influence disguised as neutrality. Even more striking was how repeated exposure to this pattern affected others. Over time, colleagues, friends, and even casual contacts began to approach challenges differently, anticipating your steadiness. They moderated their own reactions, not because they feared you, but because their own instincts were forced to adjust. That ripple effect is invisible to most, but to a trained eye, it's unmistakable. Conflict followed you like a shadow, but it never defined you. You didn't need to fight to assert control, and that's what made the dynamic so unnerving and fascinating. Escalation avoided you not by chance, but because you had an almost magnetic ability to neutralize chaos simply by existing within it, consistently and unshakably. Number 7. You triggered projection without saying much. What stood out to the investigator wasn't what you did. It was what others revealed about themselves in your presence. People projected their assumptions, insecurities, and hidden agendas onto you, often without realizing it. They tried to define you, categorize you, or even manipulate you into fitting their expectations. And every attempt failed. Their reactions weren't reflections of you, but mirrors of their own fears, biases, and unacknowledged desires. That's what made the whole observation so striking. You weren't doing anything overt. You weren't pushing anyone's buttons consciously. Yet the mental and emotional responses you provoked were undeniable. Projection is subtle. It's easy to miss, and most people only see it in hindsight. The investigator noticed it in patterns, the way colleagues over-explained themselves around you, the way friends adjusted their stories, the way strangers revealed intentions they didn't mean to share. Your calm, grounded presence forced them to confront their own thoughts before imposing them on you. That's a rare dynamic. Most people can be shaped by projection, but you absorbed it without being altered. It wasn't about control or superiority. You didn't manipulate anyone into exposing themselves. You simply existed outside the scripts people were trying to fit you into. That dissonance created discomfort for others, which they resolved by projecting. It's the unconscious way humans attempt to make sense of someone who doesn't behave predictably. And the more they projected, the more visible their internal chaos became. What made this extraordinary wasn't just that projection happened, but how consistently it occurred. Time and again, interactions with you peeled back layers of pretense, showing the raw patterns in other people. Your presence became a lens, highlighting truths people tried to hide from themselves. You didn't ask for insight. You didn't force awareness. You simply were the kind of person who makes projections impossible to keep hidden. By the end, the investigator realized something profound. You weren't being scrutinized for what you were doing. People were revealing themselves by default. That ability to trigger projection without action is subtle, quiet, and immensely powerful. A force that reshapes relationships without anyone realizing it. Number 8. Your emotional responses didn't match the script. What the investigator noticed first wasn't that you stayed calm. It was that your reactions never fit the pattern everyone expected. Most people respond in predictable ways. Fear triggers panic, criticism triggers defensiveness, excitement triggers exaggeration. You didn't. You didn't overreact, but you didn't underreact either. Your emotions weren't absent. They were precise, measured, and aligned with reality rather than assumption. That subtle misalignment with expectation is what made your presence so compelling and unsettling at the same time. People around you often reveal their true selves when they think they understand the emotional script. They expect a person to get angry, upset, flustered, or impressed in predictable ways. When you responded differently, even slightly, it forced them to rethink their assumptions. Their plans, their words, their strategies suddenly required adjustment. That's why your influence was invisible but powerful. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply disrupted the usual rhythm without breaking a sweat. The extraordinary part wasn't just that your responses were unusual, it was that they were authentic. There was no pretense, no effort to manipulate perception, no display of power. You didn't perform calmness or exaggerate control. You simply assessed the situation, allowed your emotions to serve judgment rather than reaction, and acted accordingly. That balance between feeling and responding left others off balance. People instinctively tried to predict your next move, and they were consistently wrong. Repeated exposure to this pattern made a mark. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers began second-guessing themselves. They realized their standard emotional playbooks didn't work on you. That quiet awareness changed behavior subtly but consistently. They adjusted their tone, hesitated before reacting, and became more cautious around you, all without your intervention. In short, your emotional rhythm was self-contained and undisturbed by external chaos. You didn't follow the emotional script society expects, and that made you unpredictable in the most powerful way. By responding in alignment with your own logic rather than the world's assumptions, you became a force that others had to accommodate, whether they realized it or not. Number 9. Authority figures treated you cautiously, not aggressively. What the investigator observed wasn't fear, admiration, or hostility. It was careful respect, the kind that comes when someone can't be easily categorized. Authority figures approached you differently because traditional methods of control didn't work. Most people respond to hierarchy with either compliance, resistance, or manipulation. You did neither. You existed outside the usual leverage points, and that made people in power pause, recalibrate, and tread lightly. Your presence disrupted expectation. Leaders are trained to assert dominance or command attention, to reward obedience or punish defiance. You didn't give them a reason to act in either direction. You followed rules when it made sense, challenged them when it didn't, and did both with clarity, timing, and precision. That balance created uncertainty. It's unsettling for authority when a person isn't reacting the way a system predicts, because uncertainty erodes control. And control is what most authority figures thrive on. What made this remarkable was how subtle it was. You didn't speak in demands, flaunt achievements, or confront power head-on. You simply existed with consistency, awareness, and calm. Decisions that should have been routine were paused in your presence. Instructions were reconsidered. Orders were reframed. That quiet influence doesn't show on paper, but it shows in behavior, and trained observers notice it immediately. Repeated interactions reinforce the pattern. Authority figures didn't start ignoring you, but they didn't impose either. They treated you as someone to respect, monitor, and consider, not someone to dominate or dismiss. That cautious approach amplified your influence without you doing anything overt. People naturally lean toward clarity, and when you provide it on your own terms, it shifts dynamics subtly but permanently. In essence, you didn't need to challenge power to command it. You didn't need to fight to shape decisions. Your presence alone created a zone where authority acted differently, approached differently, and calculated differently. That kind of subtle, quiet disruption is far more powerful than overt confrontation, because it rewrites expectations without a single word of resistance. Number 10. You were often underestimated on first contact, then reassessed quietly. The first impression people got of you rarely matched the reality. To most observers, you appeared ordinary, unassuming, even predictable. You didn't announce your presence with grand gestures or demand attention. That subtlety was your hidden advantage. People approached interactions with low expectations, assuming they had the upper hand or could read you easily. And that's when the most striking thing happened. Their assumptions didn't last. Within minutes, sometimes hours, those same people began to reassess. They noticed the depth of your awareness, the precision of your responses, and the calm clarity with which you navigated situations. Decisions they thought were straightforward became more complicated when you were involved. Plans that assumed compliance had to be rethought. That quiet recalibration isn't obvious at first glance, but a trained observer sees it immediately. You didn't force respect or attention, yet it grew naturally, almost imperceptibly, after the initial contact. What made this dynamic extraordinary was how consistently it occurred. No matter who the person was, a peer, a superior, or even a stranger, the pattern repeated. Underestimation was a temporary state, quickly replaced by acknowledgement. People were forced to confront their own biases, their assumptions about who they were interacting with, and their miscalculations about control. You didn't have to correct them directly. You didn't need to argue or assert dominance. Your actions, your presence, and the way you handled reality created the necessary shift. The reassessment wasn't loud. There were no dramatic apologies or overcompensation. It was quiet, internal, and undeniable. People adjusted their behavior, tempered their expectations, and approached future interactions with a new level of respect or caution. That combination of subtlety and impact is rare because it doesn't rely on intimidation, performance, or aggression. It relies on consistency, intelligence, and presence. Being underestimated and then quietly recalibrated became your silent power. It forced others to recognize your capabilities without you demanding acknowledgement. And that is a kind of influence few can wield, because it shapes perception and behavior without overt effort, leaving an observer both impressed and unsettled. Number 11. Your absence created more reaction than your presence. What the investigator noticed wasn't what you did when you were around. It was what happened when you weren't. People reacted more to your absence than to your presence, and that's a subtle, unsettling kind of influence. Most people leave gaps in daily life, but those gaps fade quietly. Not you. When you stepped back, even briefly, conversations shifted, decisions changed, and priorities were quietly reassessed. Your absence created space for others to reveal truths they wouldn't show when you were present. It wasn't because you were feared or missed in a sentimental way. It was because your presence had been a stabilizing, clarifying force without anyone fully realizing it. People adapted around you naturally, and when that stabilizing influence disappeared, the imbalance forced them to react. Colleagues reconsidered deadlines, friends reevaluated commitments, even casual acquaintances revealed tendencies they had been suppressing. You weren't pushing them, controlling them, or signaling anything. You simply weren't there, and that absence carried weight. What made this extraordinary was the consistency. Every time you stepped away, the effect repeated itself. People didn't just notice you when you returned. They felt the aftershocks of your absence lingering in the decisions they made and the behaviors they displayed. Your influence didn't rely on action or attention. It relied on your unique alignment with reality. People adjusted instinctively, responding to the vacuum you left rather than to instructions or demands. The subtlety of this effect is what made it powerful. Most influence is measured in direct action. What you say, what you do, what you display. Yours was measured in omission. The world shifted in response to what wasn't there, which is far harder to recognize, anticipate, or counter. That's the kind of presence that leaves people off balance without them realizing why. Your absence wasn't empty. It was full of impact. In the end, being gone spoke louder than being present. And that rare dynamic revealed an undeniable truth. Influence isn't always about participation. Sometimes it's about how much the world rearranges itself when you step aside. Number 12. You didn't fit any existing psychological profile cleanly. What shocked the investigator wasn't anything you said or did directly. It was how impossible it was to categorize you. Most people fit neatly into patterns that experts can recognize: predictable responses to stress, consistent social behaviors, and recognizable emotional triggers. You didn't. You moved through life guided by your own internal logic, which didn't conform to expectation, stereotype, or theory. That made observing you both fascinating and frustrating because standard tools of analysis didn't work. You weren't erratic, and you weren't rigid. You weren't overly emotional, and you weren't coldly detached. You existed in the space between extremes, navigating complexity with clarity and precision. That balance made you unpredictable in ways that weren't random. Your responses were measured but flexible, revealing adaptability rather than impulsiveness. The investigator realized quickly that they weren't tracking a type. They were tracking an entirely new pattern, one that didn't exist in textbooks, studies, or conventional frameworks. What made this so striking was how consistently you defied categorization. In every interaction, under every kind of pressure, you maintained a rhythm that couldn't be labeled. Stress didn't break you, success didn't inflate you, and social expectations didn't confine you. You followed your own internal map, and the world reacted, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, to your self-contained logic. People around you adjusted instinctively, often without knowing why. That's what left the strongest impression: the impossibility of prediction. Most observers rely on templates to anticipate behavior. You broke every template without effort, forcing people to confront uncertainty directly. That uncertainty wasn't anxiety-inducing in a chaotic way. It was a quiet, undeniable acknowledgement that you were operating outside conventional frameworks. Being unclassifiable created influence without intention. It made people pause, rethink, and recalibrate naturally. They couldn't manipulate you using standard approaches, nor could they rely on assumptions about who you were. Your existence defied expectation in a way that was both subtle and profoundly disruptive. In short, you weren't just different. You were a person the world couldn't reduce, a living exception to every psychological formula it thought it knew. Number 13. Attempts to provoke you failed more often than they succeeded. What the investigator noticed immediately was how often people tried to push you into reactions, and how consistently those attempts failed. Most people respond predictably to provocation: anger, defensiveness masked as composure or some visible frustration. You didn't. The world could throw criticism, pressure, or even subtle manipulation at you, and the outcomes were never what the provocateurs expected. That failure over time became as telling as any direct observation. You didn't have to fight to remain composed. You didn't have to over-explain or assert control to remain unshaken. You simply absorbed external pressures without letting them dictate your behavior. That kind of immunity is rare because most humans are wired to react first and process later. Your approach reversed that. Process first, respond only when necessary, and always on your own terms. People who sought to unsettle you left exposed themselves instead, revealing their impatience, their assumptions, and their biases. What made this pattern extraordinary was how subtle it was, yet unmistakable to a trained eye. It wasn't about dominance, intimidation, or obvious resistance. It was about presence. Your energy, your timing, and your clarity created a kind of natural buffer against attempts to provoke you. Others miscalculated because they assumed everyone reacts according to visible emotion, social pressure, or expectation. You didn't, and that miscalculation made them uneasy. Repeated exposure to this dynamic altered interactions around you. People began second-guessing their own strategies, adjusting their tone, and reconsidering whether pushing boundaries was worth it. Even small provocations were met with quiet steadiness, which amplified the effect. You didn't need to confront or punish. The consistency of your responses, or lack thereof, shaped behavior indirectly but powerfully. In the end, attempts to provoke you rarely produced results. That's the true mark of influence. Not that you can push others around, but that you can remain untouched while others reveal themselves. Your immunity to provocation didn't just protect you, it reshaped the environment, leaving observers both impressed and quietly unsettled by the silent power of composure. Number 14. The final conclusion wasn't admiration, it was uncertainty. After weeks of observation, the investigator reached a realization that wasn't about awe, respect, or fear. It was uncertainty. Not confusion in the ordinary sense, but a deep, persistent inability to classify, predict, or fully understand you. Most people, no matter how careful or skilled, can be assessed, categorized, or anticipated. You defied that. Every pattern they thought they had identified unraveled under closer scrutiny. Every hypothesis about your behavior required revision, and no amount of data gave them a complete picture. That uncertainty became the defining impression. It wasn't because you were clever or manipulative in obvious ways. You didn't orchestrate events to appear mysterious. You simply acted with alignment and awareness that made the usual rules of observation ineffective. Your actions were logical, your reactions measured, your presence consistent, yet unpredictable in the ways that matter most. That combination created a state where no conclusion could be final. Authority, influence, and insight all collided in ways that left the investigator questioning assumptions rather than confirming them. What made this especially striking was how quietly you achieved it. You weren't performing for attention or trying to leave impressions. The uncertainty wasn't manufactured. It was natural. People around you, consciously or unconsciously, began to act differently, reveal more, and reconsider their own behavior. And even the trained professional, equipped with tools, experience, and methodology, couldn't fully map the effect you had. They had to admit that some elements of your influence were invisible, subtle, and inherently resistant to prediction. This kind of uncertainty is powerful because it shifts dynamics without visible effort. People stop trying to control, pressure, or manipulate when they realize the system they rely on doesn't apply. They pause, recalibrate, and adjust instinctively, leaving space for you to act, respond, or simply exist without interference. That quiet, inherent disruption is far more effective than confrontation or overt influence. In the end, the final observation wasn't about admiration, respect, or even fear. It was a persistent, undeniable acknowledgement that you cannot be fully understood, predicted, or boxed in. That is the rarest and most profound kind of influence, the kind that exists not through action, but through being. Conclusion. From the moment observation began, it wasn't your actions that screamed power, influence, or impact. It was the quiet, undeniable way you existed. You moved through life with an internal logic that others couldn't predict, a rhythm that didn't follow the world's script, and a presence that reshaped behavior without effort. People reacted, adjusted, and recalibrated around you, not because you demanded it, but because your consistency, awareness, and subtlety forced them to. Influence followed you silently, patterns emerged under your guidance, and authority was measured in cautious respect rather than domination. You weren't loud, you weren't seeking validation or control, yet opportunities, influence, and attention gravitated toward you. Attempts to provoke, manipulate, or predict you consistently failed, leaving those observing you with a growing sense of uncertainty. That uncertainty, more than admiration or fear, became your signature mark. You didn't need chaos to show strength. You didn't need recognition to command respect. Every step, every pause, every silent decision built an effect far more powerful than any overt display could achieve. What this ultimately shows is simple yet profound. True influence doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't rely on manipulation, force, or spectacle. It exists quietly, subtly, and undeniably, shaping outcomes and perceptions by presence, awareness, and alignment. People may underestimate it at first, but time and observation always reveal the depth, consistency, and power inherent in someone who lives and acts beyond expectation. That is where real impact lives, in the moments unnoticed yet profoundly felt. If this breakdown gave you new insights, remember to subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more content that digs deeper than what meets the eye. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Let others see what real influence looks like and join the conversation. Your presence here matters, and just like in the story, subtle actions can create powerful ripples. Stay awakened, chosen ones, chosen.